Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and welcome back to part 8, or the finale of our Guandu Let's Talk lore series, titled Resolution. Now, we ended our last episode with Cao Cao raiding Wuchao, but instead of sending reinforcements to save the supply depot, Yuan Shao opted for Guotu's plan, as he sent Zhang He and Gao Lan to attack Cao Cao's main camp at Guandu, believing that Cao Cao must have taken the majority of his forces with him for this raid, and thus leaving the camp sparsely defended. Yet in reality, Cao Cao only took less than half of his force with him to Wuchao, as he left Cao Hong and Xun You, the rest of his army, with strict orders to hold down the fort at all cost. So with Cao Hong and Xun You expecting this attack, Guandu held firmly, despite Zhang He and Gao Lan's best effort to assault the fort. Meanwhile, back at Wuchao, the situation was exactly the opposite, as Chun Yiqiong's forces were not expecting any attack, and with Xu You's help, Cao Cao had managed to disguise his army as Yuan Shao's reinforcement, and by the time that Chun Yiqiong knew what was happening, Wuchao was already ablaze, and his unsuspecting army was already getting slaughtered. Especially with the majority of his men still in bed during this pre-dawn attack, Wuchao didn't stand a chance, as Chun Yiqiong himself was soon captured alive by Yue Jin. And not only was he captured alive, but Yue Jin also cut off Chun Yiqiong's nose. Now, this was no accidental battle wound, as Cao Cao had planned to extend his victories here at Wuchao with a follow-up psychological attack on Yuan Shao's army. So he had actually ordered all his troops to cut off all the nose and ears of the enemy troop, as they had plans to bag up these body parts and dump them in front of Yuan Shao's main camp to shock the enemy morale. So as the dust cleared at Wuchao, Cao Cao's army busied themselves cleaning up the battlefield by collecting the ears and noses off of all of Yuan Shao's troops, and for good measures, they even cut off the tongues of the cattle and sheep that were among the livestock and tossed them into a big pile to make the bags of body parts look even bigger. Then, with all the food and supplies destroyed, Cao Cao would split up his force in two, as one unit rode off for Yuan Shao's main camp and the other returned back to Guandu. And when both groups reached their destination, they would dump the bags and bags full of nose, ears, and tongue out onto the ground, as they declared they had eliminated Chun Yiqiong's forces at Wuchao and burned up all their supplies. Now at this time, both Zhang He and Gao Lan were already extremely frustrated with Yuan Shao. First, their plan of reinforcing Wuchao was passed up, as Yuan Shao opted for Guotu's plan to siege Guandu instead. Then after they were met by fierce resistance from Cao Hong and Xun You at Guandu, they had tried to inform Yuan Shao that this plan was not going to work. But Guotu, who was now looking out for his own neck for giving this plan, started to place the blame on Zhang He and Gao Lan, as he accused them of purposely trying to lose at Guandu to make the point, as revenge for not having their strategy picked. So when Cao Cao's men returned, Zhang He and Gao Lan decided to surrender on the spot, as they decided to burn away all of Yuan Shao's siege weapons, as they turned their sword on their former master, as they now prepare to join Cao Cao in the final attack on Yuan Shao's main camp, since they knew full well that if they had just returned to Yuan Shao, they would have been blamed for all the failures today. And when the news of Zhang He and Gao Lan's betrayal would reach back to Yuan Shao's main camp, compounding on top of the news that Wuchao has fallen, the morale evaporated. So Yuan Shao and his eldest son Yuan Tan decided that this was the time to abandon camp, as they both rode away with their cavalry units, leaving behind tens of thousands of infantry left to fend for themselves. Sure enough, when Cao Cao's army would arrive at Yuan Shao's camp, most of these remaining units would just surrender, while those who resisted were promptly killed. Now in the end, resisting or surrendering would make very little difference, as Cao Cao did not trust the loyalty of any of these units, nor did he have the food and the wealth necessary to feed and pay them. So everyone aside from Zhang He and Gao Lan's unit were promptly killed off, either during the fighting or buried alive soon after surrendering. And with that, the Battle of Guandu is officially over, with Cao Cao scoring an unlikely victory. In the end, of the 110,000 troops mustered up by Yuan Shao, roughly 70 to 80,000 would perish here, as only 800 units of cavalry would return to Liyang alongside Yuan Shao, while the remaining troops were shattered, as it would take a few more weeks of fleeing and hiding before they would manage to regroup with Yuan Shao back in Liyang. However, despite the severity of this defeat, Yuan Shao still had control of the 4 northern provinces. He still had more wealth, more land, and more troops than Cao Cao, but there would be no more plans for launching another assault, as Yuan Shao was so demoralized when he returned to Liyang that he joked with his general Jiang Qi, who had been stationed there, that his life was now in his hand, implying that if Jiang Qi wanted to, he could easily kill off the 800 guards and bring Yuan Shao's head to Cao Cao. But of course, Jiang Qi did not do that, as Yuan Shao's governance of the north had been overwhelmingly positive, and while his decision-making on the battlefield might have been lacking, his administrative talent and diplomatic touch were both superb, as the north flourished during the years under Yuan Shao's rule, and the relationship with the northern nomadic tribes were also very stable. Of course, this defeat did have some effect, as it encouraged and triggered a few subversive elements in the north to rebel in the month following Guandu. But these rebellions in the Ji province were small and regional, and Yuan Shao wasted no time in putting them down, as he would go on and spend the next 2 years stabilizing the north as his health continued to deteriorate until he would finally pass away in 202. But before we jump that far ahead, we still need to return to the battlefields at Guandu, as not everyone was as lucky as Yuan Shao and made their escape back north. So first off, we have Chun Yuqiong, who had been captured by Yue Jin at Wuchao. Now at first, Cao Cao wanted to spare him, as Chun Yuqiong had been a fellow 8 captains of the West Palace alongside Cao Cao, so they were colleagues in the past. But Xu You reminded Cao Cao that Chun Yuqiong can't be trusted, as every time he would look in the mirror, he would be reminded of his missing nose. So to avoid any trust issues in the future, Cao Cao executed Chun Yuqiong. Now speaking of Xu You, remember how his betrayal of Yuan Shao was triggered when Shen Pei imprisoned his family members back in Xuchang? Well, after the dust settled at Guandu, both of Shen Pei's sons, who were serving in Yuan Shao's army, ended up captured by Cao Cao, as they now became prisoners of war. Another important figure captured was poor Ju Shuo, who Yuan Shao did not bring with him during the retreat. Now at first, Cao Cao tried to convince Ju Shuo to work for him, but Ju Shuo kept yelling out that he was not going to surrender as he seeked to fight to the death. Hungry for talent, Cao Cao had Ju Shuo restrained and offered him a position as his advisor. But unfortunately, despite repeatedly receiving Yuan Shao's cold shoulder, Ju Shuo was still loyal to Yuan Shao, and even after joining Cao Cao, he tried to sneak back to Yuan Shao in secret, but ended up being captured by Cao Cao, and seeing that Ju Shuo was not willing to work for him, Cao Cao also had him executed as well. Now if you remember, alongside Ju Shuo, there was another Yuan Shao advisor who had originally favored a slow approach in the campaign against Cao Cao, and that advisor would be Tian Feng. Fortunately for him, his argument with Yuan Shao regarding the timing of the attack on Cao Cao when Yuan Shao's son was sick had actually landed him in prison back in Ye, so he had been spared from being captured by Cao Cao at Guandu. But unfortunately for him, due to the shame from not listening to him, Yuan Shao now worried about how to face Tian Feng when he went back, especially after he overheard his own troops crying over the fact that they had lost because they didn't listen to Tian Feng's advice. And it was not just Yuan Shao who worried about how he would face Tian Feng, but also other advisors who had pushed for this failed strategy at Guandu, now worried what if Yuan Shao went back and released Tian Feng and punished them instead. So to prevent this, Pang Ji started to tell Yuan Shao about how he overheard that Tian Feng has been laughing at Yuan Shao and was elated when he heard the news of Yuan Shao's defeat at Guandu. Enraged and a bit relieved upon hearing this, Yuan Shao knew he now had the excuse to execute Tianfeng, as he ordered for Tianfeng's death before even returning to Ye. And this story here is actually extra ironic, as in reality, when Tianfeng had first heard about Yuan Shao's defeat from the warden was trying to be nice to him, as he thought that when Yuan Shao returned, Tianfeng would be released as he was proven right. To which Tianfeng replied, had Yuan Shao won at Guandu, he would have been overjoyed and probably released me to gloat. But now that he's defeated, given his prideful nature, he would definitely kill me, rather than having me around to remind him of his failures at Guandu. And sure enough, for the last time in his life, Tianfeng was once again proven correct. Now, another key member of the Guandu campaign was Liu Bei, who had the foresight to leave Yuan Shao before he ultimately failed. And as he returned to Runan, he absorbed the local Yellow Turbans led by Guandu. And now with Yuan Shao defeated, Cao Cao would finally be able to turn his attention to Liu Bei. At first, to give his main forces a rest, Cao Cao simply sent General Cai Yang to try to chase Liu Bei out of Runan. But surprisingly, Liu Bei's forces were much stronger than anticipated, as Cai Yang would end up dying in this battle against Liu Bei. So in 201, without too much time to rest, Cao Cao would once again mobilize his main force as he personally marched on Liu Bei. And knowing full well that he had no chance against Cao Cao's main force, Liu Bei abandoned Runan as he fled into the Jin province, where he would link up with Liu Bei, who was also now afraid that Cao Cao would seek revenge for his position with Yuan Shao during the Battle of Guandu. So Liu Bei took Liu Bei in and offered him a position in the border town of Xinye as a deterrent against Cao Cao in a very similar fashion as Zhang Xiu. But with the Yuan clan still a threat in the north, Cao Cao would leave Liu Bei alone because he did not want to start a war with Liu Bei. And for the next few years, finishing up the Yuan clan would remain Cao Cao's #1 priority. But we're going to save that for another series, as our Guandu Let's Talk Lore series comes to official end here. So hopefully you all enjoyed this series, and there will be a poll that's live on the community page here on YouTube, where you can vote on the topic of the next Let's Talk Lore series starting next week. So please go vote for what you want to see next, and I'll see you all then. Bye!